Make that big boss less special. It ain't no game, but they saying welcome to the second level. Second level. Second level gaming. Second level.
Hello, hello. Thank you all for coming out. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Christopher Badell from Greater Than Games. He's going to be giving us a talk about making games over a variety of mediums. Christopher?
Hello. Is this on? Oh, thank you. I did not check the mic beforehand, and as I walked on stage, I was like, I should turn that on. Hi, I'm Christopher Badell. I own a company called Greater Than Games, and I've made a bunch of games. I primarily make board games, card games, tabletop games. I'm currently making a role-playing game. And those are all fun. That's where my heart is. That's what I like making. But a couple of my games have been turned into video games over the years. And I also am currently making a video game that's not related to any of board games and card games. And I also have a podcast about the lore of one of my games. And then I also do live streams on Twitch. I do a bunch of different things about these games, mostly because every so often somebody will say, hey, can you keep talking about the thing you were talking about? And the answer is, well, yes, I definitely can. In 2010, a friend of mine and I said, man, it would be great if there was a game that made me feel like a superhero. That the feeling that I feel when I read a comic book, what if that existed in a game form? And so we played every board game, card game, tabletop game, video game that we could find that was about superheroes, that was a Marvel game or a DC game or whatever. Just went down that whole rabbit hole, and we never really found anything that had that feeling, that made me feel like I am a superhero when I'm playing this game. And so we made a game called Sentinels of Multiverse with no intention to sell it or market it or anything dumb like that. Just going to make it for ourselves. Because all that stuff is hard and difficult and challenging and not recommended unless you really want to do it. So we made this game, and we played it with a bunch of friends, and it was just for us. And one of those friends was like, oh my goodness, this game is really fun. It's really interesting. I really enjoy it. I'm like, okay, cool, thanks. That's great. That's what we wanted. That's why we made the game. And he's like, no, like, you should turn this into a product. You should sell this. So, long story short, we did that thing. We made a company in 2011, and we printed this game professionally with a printer, and we took it to Gen Con 2011. We took several thousand copies there, and we sold out of that first print run of 5,000 copies in 6 months, which is very fast for the board game industry. And that kind of launched an empire. We did it without Kickstarter. We just did it ourselves. And since then, we've made many expansions to that game, many other games. And we, in 2016, ran a Kickstarter for the final expansion to that game, the expansion that ends that run of games. And we asked for $40,000 on Kickstarter for that, and we made that in 7 minutes. That Kickstarter ended in 24 days. We didn't run a full 30 days at $1.5 million for a dumb superhero game that I just really wanted to play, and it didn't exist. So why is the point of what I'm talking about, the point of what I do, and really the fact that, like I said, I have a podcast, I've got a couple of video games, I've got card games, board games, and an RPG, and they're all taking place in this world of Sentinel Comics, which is a fictional, made-up comic book world that I have written 70 years of comic book history. I can tell you what year, what different comic books came out, even though none of them ever actually really existed. They're all in my head. And what I'm here to talk about today, for the next however long, really kicking off the stage, is why. Why would I do such a thing, and how did this work? So when I started making these games, they were because I wanted them to exist. They're like, man, if I'm going to make this card game, like if I were playing this card game about Spider-Man, I'd want these cards to have quotes from Spider-Man comics from forever ago up until now. So I wrote all those comics, and I did all these things. And that ended up, accidentally, I can now, with the lens of history, look back and go, oh, this is really a good idea. You should do this sort of thing. Of creating all of this backstory means that then when it was time for me to look at maybe making a board game instead of just a card game or a video game or making a podcast, I had infinite history to draw on. So I guess kind of the point here of what I'm talking about here is by doing extra work, I future-proofed my work by giving myself a lot of other platforms to leap off of because this ended up being successful. If I'd made this thing and it wasn't successful, it'd be fine. Like, all right, cool, I made it for me and I enjoyed playing it. But because it was successful and people were like, oh, we want more, the first question we got at Gen Con 2011 when we had the core game was, where are the expansions for this game? And it was like, we just made this. We put hundreds of hours of work into it, and we spent a ton of our own money, and some of other people's money as well, to print this game. There's no way we could possibly make an expansion. But the market was demanding one, and so we did a Kickstarter in November of 2011 for an expansion. And that was back in the Wild West of Kickstarter. Nobody knew how Kickstarter worked back then. Like, seriously. People, I think we had a pledge level where we would hand make a dice bag for you out of leather. I did some, I made patches, I made buttons myself with a button stamping machine. Because I don't know what people want for rewards. We asked for $12,000 on that, and we made $27,000. And we're like, oh my God, we made $27,000. Kickstarter. But because we'd done all this work, because we'd written all these stories, it was easy to write an expansion for that. It was great. Well, I've already done all the materials for it. So the topic that I proposed for this talk is writing across multiple mediums. And the point is, whenever I make anything, whenever I do any creative writing or game design or any sort of storytelling that fits in that spectrum, I try to look at what I'm writing for, what I'm writing about, and what it's going to do in the long run. With this product, with any of the Sentinel Comics stuff, I'm writing for me. But it turns out I'm not special. I'm a person who is a nerd who likes playing video games, board games, card games, and I like comic books. So like, I narrow down, it's like every so often somebody's like, oh, well, I'm into Star Wars. I don't know if you guys have heard of Star Wars. I'm into Star Wars. That makes me special. It's like, everybody's into Star Wars. Like, Star Wars is the biggest movies that have come out in the last few years. Everyone's into Star Wars. You're not special. So when you look at the things that you like, figure out, okay, this is the thing that I like, and I'm designing this game in some way for me. So can I extrapolate? Can I zoom out a little bit, look at who I am as a person, as a consumer, and figure out, because I like these things, I should probably be looking at these other groups of people that also are into these same things. And because of the things that I wanted in this game, I wanted the history, I wanted the story, I wanted the feeling of when I'm playing this game, I have this feedback of, oh, I am my character. I'm not controlling my character, but I actually am, like, I'm in their shoes, and I have their history and I have their story. That when it's happening as a card game, or as a board game, or as a tabletop game, works across all of them because it has the groundwork for them. So the stuff that I do to make those things happen is I look at what are the commonalities of experience between what I'm doing at the table and what the character is supposed to, what the thing I'm doing at the table is emulating. If I'm making a character who is a super speed character, I want to play, I want my turns to oddly not go fast. I want to play lots of things in the course of a turn where each player has the same turn. Great. Each turn you do 3 things. You play a card. Well, on a speedster's turn, they're going to play several cards because they're just faster. On a super-powered, super strong person's turn, they're going to play 1 card and it's going to hit really hard. On a person who's like a magical, controlling sort of character's turn, they're going to do a thing that lets somebody else do a thing. So that they're not just doing themselves, they're doing something for themselves, they're doing something for another player. And those kind of broad categories of the way I'm doing things across the different turns work whether or not, regardless of the nitty-gritty of what sort of game it is. Cool. So that's kind of the approach that I take whenever I'm designing a game, and also whenever I'm telling a story. As a storyteller, a lot of game creating, especially a lot of game design, is storytelling. Is putting the pieces out there rather than storytelling in the here are the pieces A, B, C, D. Is storytelling in the here's a box of Legos, put it together however you like, but you've done clever things in which the Legos go together in certain ways more easily and certain ways more difficult, and that leads people down roads that you've planned out in advance that people don't feel like you've planned out in advance, if that makes sense. Kind of tricking people into having the experience that you want them to have without specifically leading them by the nose to that experience. So that's kind of the approach that I take when I'm telling stories, when I'm making games. Then the turning a product, turning a game, turning a story from one genre, from one medium better, to another, turning it into a video game, you've got to look at how that changes the game. So the first video game that I made was just a straight up port of a card game to a video game. And I didn't make that. I've got other people who made that for me. In 2011, when we were at Gen Con, a company came to us and they said, hey, we see you have this game. It's like one of the new hotness at this convention. We'd like to purchase the rights to make a video game. And I was like, yeah, sure, that sounds great. I'd love to have a video game of my game, and I'm sure not going to do it. And so they're like, great, we'll give you $1,000 starting, and at that point in time, that was infinite money. And so like, we'll give you $1,000, and then we'll spin up these things over the course of the year, and then we'll have something to show you within a year. And the cleverest thing that I did that year was I said, okay, good, great, great. If by this time next year, by Gen Con, by August of 2012, there's not at least something to show for this, the rights come back to me. And they're like, yeah, sure, cool, no problem. And that happened. They didn't do anything with it, which was great. Because, in retrospect, now I look at that license, and it would have been terrible if they did something with it. Probably, the game probably would have turned out okay, but I wouldn't have controlled it. Since then, another company, in late 2012, another company came to us and said, we're going to make a video game. And at this point, A, I knew the value of $1,000. And I, B, knew the value of the product that I'd made, of the stories that I was telling. And so with that contract, I said, look, you don't need to pay us anything down. That's irrelevant. And we're going to take a pretty small cut on all of the individual sales. When you're making sales, when you're making profits, we get a small cut of those profits. But we don't make anything until you make a profit off of it. And you have no creative control over the thing that you're making. I do. This is a terrible, terrible license agreement. Never, as a person who's making a video game or making a game that is based on somebody else's IP or something, don't enter into an agreement like this. It's terrible. Because every time the video game company does anything, they have to email me and say, Christopher, we want to put out these ads. Christopher, we want this thing to, we want the button when you click it, it's a yellow button. When you click it, it turns a slightly darker shade of yellow for a second. And then, is this shade okay? Yes. Yes, it is. Or no, it's not. And this is because it's my baby. I've been working on this game forever, and so like I wanted to make sure that I had control. And after this first contract went away, I realized, no. I want to make sure that, like in the future, I have this level of control. But as a result of this level of control, the game feels still, when you're playing a video game and you no longer have that feeling of I have a hand of cards, I'm sitting at the table, I'm doing this action, you've lost all of the parts that I programmed into the game in the first place. I mentioned that you've got this box of Legos where you're trying to trick people into creating an experience that they feel is unique to them, but really you've kind of created some aspect of it in advance. In a video game, you lose a lot of those things because you're just clicking on the screen, and you expect things to react when you're clicking on the screen. You're not the person playing the game isn't in charge of everything that's happening at the table anymore. And so we had to put in a lot of things that made the players feel more connected to the screen than just, oh, I'm watching the thing happen and I click it and it makes it happen. But actually, no, I'm moving the thing over here, and when I'm doing that, I turn it over and it does a thing. And not putting a burden of the physics on the player, but still keeping them connected to their character, making sure that they didn't feel like, oh, I'm controlling this character. No, I am this character while I'm playing. And a lot of that went back to the stuff that I said about the sort of character you are, the story of the player, of the character you are, influences the actions that you should be taking, influences the mechanics that you use when you build a deck, when you build a board game, when you build a video game, the physical activity that a person is engaging in. That's why I love a lot of the stuff that happens at Pixelpop, is because there's a lot of cool experimental games that are done here that aren't just, I push buttons on a Joy-Con or something, but actually, no, I'm going to move something in physical space, or I'm going to do something and that is going to interact with the thing that's happening in a video game. Because that's how you get somebody, muscle memory, sense memory, your lizard brain engaging is what is going to make somebody go, oh, at the end of that, that's a thing that I did. It wasn't just like, oh, I pushed a button and then something happened, but rather, I made the choice to do this, and the resulting activity came from the choice that I made. So yeah, with that video game, like I said, that one was just straight up turning that first card game that I made into a video game. Now I'm working on a video game that is in the same IP. It's the same superheroes that I made up in 2010 that definitely don't exist anywhere except for my creations. And I don't think of them as real superheroes like I do in my mind because I made them, but I realize they're not real. Nobody's ever read comics about them. But at this point in time, hundreds of thousands of people around the world have played these games and know these characters and have personal experiences with them. And I get emails from them, and they listen to my podcast, and they tell me that I got something wrong in one episode, and that's great. And that makes me go, oh, so these characters are real now. And so I kind of now have this burden of like making sure that to still be bringing them to life in whatever I'm making. And that's great, and that's fun, and that's good. Because if I told you I'm making a Spider-Man game, you'd immediately know, oh, Spider-Man game, he's got to do these things. He's got to do thwip, and he's got to run and jump off of things, and he does webs, and he is making jokes the whole time. That's who Spider-Man is. And so you've got a lower barrier to entry there. But with any game, like people talk about games that are based on an IP and an intellectual property, like Spider-Man, every game has an IP. Every game has a story. Even the most abstract, I was going to say chess, that's not even abstract enough. Even Go, the process of playing the game, a story unfolds in the playing of the game. And the work that you do towards making sure that the mechanics of your game match with the story That goes a long way. That turns the experience of playing a new game into a story. Because at the end of the game, the story that you tell about a game that you played, if you and another person play a game, at the end of that game, you tell the story about what happened. You don't say, oh, well, I moved this piece, and then they moved this piece, but then I moved this piece, and they moved it. No, that's boring. You say, well, I had this whole formation that I came in from this side, but then they had this defense that they did. That story that's unfolding, it's kind of singular to the mechanics of that game. So when you're making a game that has these one set of mechanics, and then you're making another thing using the same property, but it doesn't have any of those same touchstones that people are used to, you have to find ways in which things feel like another thing. Whether it's, okay, if I play a card, that action, I know what playing a card feels like. In a video game, I don't have that. Do I drag a card up? Hearthstone, the very popular card game that no one's ever heard of, Hearthstone, that Blizzard made. They do a really good job of feeling like it's not just that it is a digital card game, that the physical card game for it doesn't exist. It was based on a physical card game, but still, it feels like you're playing a card game, not just that you're clicking on cards on the screen. Because a lot of the actions that you're doing evoke that same sort of feeling. Hearthstone itself doesn't have any of the story of the game that needs to be a card game. That's the failing of the game. It doesn't matter. It's a Blizzard giant game. It's going to do great. They don't need my advice. But there's nothing about the mechanics of the experience of playing Hearthstone that it is like, yes, and I'm playing a card game for these reasons. Like the story you're unfolding when you're playing that game is that the two players are both like fighters, warriors, mages, rogues, whatever, and they're fighting each other, and they're bringing out their allies, and they're fighting for some reason. Whereas the game Red Dragon Inn, which is a much less popular but still does fine for itself game, the story of that game is, yeah, we're all wizards, dragons, clerics, rogues, whatever, and we're hanging out at an inn. We've just done our adventure, and we're drinking, and we're gambling, and we're brawling in this tavern. And the mechanics of what we're doing at the table match the story of what's unfolding. I think that's a great example of how that works. And people talk about, we're going to do a video game version of Red Dragon Inn. I say, great, why? Who cares? Like, sure, people will play it, but there's no way in which the mechanics there, you lose that connection. Okay. This is why people have slides. I don't know. So the video game is the one that I'm making now. It's unconnected to any of these other things that I've done before, except that it's an IP. Except that it has the same IP. It has the same superheroes, the Sentinels of the Multiverse, the Sentinel Comics superheroes. And it's a tactics sort of game, not a grid-based tactics, open sort of tactics game. And the thing that connects it is the stories, that I'm telling these stories. But the mechanics are completely unique to it. There's really no comparison to any of the other games that I've made, because I'm in a video game now and I can do things. I'm no longer hampered by I have to make somebody dig through a deck or turn over a card. The game does it all for me. So in the making of this game, and again, I'm not programming this game. I don't do that. There's a company that's doing all the programming for the game, and they once again gave me complete creative control, and so I get to say how things work in the game, but they're the ones ultimately doing the program. And in the process of working through this, we're like, okay, we need to make sure that the fast character is zipping around the field, and she has like unlimited speed, essentially. Whereas the big, strong, or like the big suit of armor character that's in a big, walking tank sort of suit needs to feel ponderous, but also needs to like unleash havoc when he's firing his weapons and things like that that make you the connection of what you're seeing on the screen and the connection of the story that you're experiencing as you're playing it is matched up with the mechanics, is matched up with the internal engine of how each character works. That the speedster, sure, she's got unlimited speed, she can go as fast as much as she wants, but the faster she's going and the more things she does in a turn, the slightly worse she is at each of them, and with compounding complications of like, okay, look, if you want to do 700 things in your turn, you can. You're going to be terrible at all of them, but go for it. Whereas the big board anymore, but you still have that connection to the activity that you're doing, the activity you're engaging in as a player matches up on both what you're doing and then the output the game is determining. You lose a little bit of that in a video game because the game says, here's what happens, don't ask why, it just does because I say so. Whereas in a board game you have a little bit more connection to that from the player side. But there's things you can do to show that, to show some of the background without showing the nitty-gritty numbers. So I'm making that game. And then like I said, I also have an RPG, a role-playing game, tabletop pen and paper style role-playing game. And that one, the mechanics of that one are super unimportant as compared to the story. In modern, not all role-playing games, but a lot of modern role-playing games, you kind of give up a bit in the way of crunchy mechanics for the mechanics that drive the story forward, for letting the story take charge of the table. So in that, once again, it's a matter of what mechanics do you employ? What mechanics do you bring in? And I looked more to comic book movies, which are kind of big right now. I don't know if you've heard, over comic books themselves, because when you're reading a comic book, the pacing is kind of the pacing that you create for it. How fast you want to read it. There's writing things and art things you can do to increase and decrease the pacing. But also, in a comic book movie, the pacing is being told to you. You're showing that. So in the Sentinel Comics role-playing game that I'm making, everybody has zones. They have your green zone, your yellow zone, your red zone. That's determined by your health, how you're doing in the moment. It's also determined by the environment. If we're in this room and things are going well and some guy's talking on a stage, we're probably in the green zone. But then as the cracks break open in the ground and lava starts pouring out and robots fall from the ceiling, we move into the yellow zone. And then once the volcano that we're all sitting on, of course, erupts and all the robots explode, we move into the red zone. And so the zone thing is also tied to the abilities of each of the characters. Where in the green zone, you have this set of abilities that are pretty cool. And you move into the yellow zone, you keep your green zone abilities, but you also get your yellow zone abilities. Those are super awesome. And then you move into the red zone abilities, and you just got stuff that's straight up overpowered. And you're like, look, I pull out the sword perfect, and I touch the pen opponent, and they just look, the sword is perfect. But I only have that in the red zone. And that's why, there's the question of when you're reading a comic book or watching a movie, an action movie, be it comic book or otherwise, you have these stories that were like, why didn't the hero use their thing at the beginning of the movie? Why they had this sort of perfect the whole time and they didn't pull it out until the end? Well, it's because it's good for pacing, it's good for storytelling, and you can match that same sort of thing in a game. And so in this, my goal is no longer, I don't care about the physical action of what you're doing at the table, because all the players in a role-playing game are describing what they're doing. They say they do whatever they want to. So my job is not to say, look, by the mechanics of this game, you have to do these things, but rather, you can do whatever you want to. Let me give you incentivized reasons to do the things that's going to make you feel like a hero. I'm no longer giving you a set of tools that you using those tools makes you a hero. Rather, I'm giving you a set of prompts, a set of encouragements that if you follow those prompts, if you follow those encouragements, you're going to have that heroic feeling. You're going to feel like you're unfolding a comic book as you play the game. And then the only other bit of media that I mentioned was the podcast. After doing this for a few years, in 2016, January 2016, we started doing this podcast. In 2013, we announced it. In June of 2013, we said, hey, people have wanted this for a long time. They've been reading these stories and playing these games and going, but who are these characters? You clearly have thousands of comic books in your head that you've never revealed. Tell us these stories. So we made we said, great, we're going to do, by we, I mean the artist of the game and myself, but we're going to do a podcast called The Letters Page, like the letters page in the back of a comic book. And we're going to tell you all the stories that came from these card games. And we put up a question submission form where people could submit questions. And within a month, we had like 4,000 questions in that form, and it quickly grew out of hand from there. And then we didn't do the podcast until 2016 because we're not podcast people. We have no idea how to do this. And we were like, yeah, we're going to do that, but we need to finish this expansion to the game, and then we'll turn and do this thing. And it never happened until we finally hired an AV guy to make our Kickstarter videos. And he said, hey, do you want to do this podcast we announced 2 years ago? Oh, yeah, we do. Then we made this podcast, and it immediately did very well. But with this, it's all of a sudden now, in the playing of these games, the story that I tell in any of these games has been, here's the backstory, here's the stuff that's like built in about this character. Now, when you're playing the game, you're experiencing the story, you're living the story of this hero, you are this hero, and the stories that I've given here are just the backgrounds, and you in the playing of the game determine really what's happening with this hero, and that's yours. And now I'm doing a podcast in which I am telling people, here's the canonical version of this story, here's how these heroes actually act. And it was really weird because I realized I am now kind of going against everything that I've done since 2010 with this game of saying, here's the building blocks, here's the pieces, now you tell the story. Now I'm just telling people the story. And I didn't want to get into a situation in which I was telling people, hey, the way that you've played this character for years is wrong. Or the way that you want to play this character in the RPG has to be done this way. There's the one way to do it. So at this point, I used a thing that I accidentally set up for myself in 2011 when I named the game Sentinels of Multiverse, and I split the stories of the game into infinite realities called the Multiverse, and said, we're going to talk about the reality in which one reality in which these comic books were printed, and here's all the stories from them. There's also infinite disparate realities in which these characters act every other which way. And no matter what you've ever done at a table playing the card game, the board game, any of the video games, the upcoming RPG, everything you've done is canon and everything you've done is correct. There's never anything that I say or do about any of these characters that supersedes anything you've ever said or done. These are your characters. And this is a thing that creators really hate. The thing that creators really are afraid of when they're doing with their IPs is the idea of like fan stuff coming in and like degrading the value of the created, the IP in some way. And it's a thing that I absolutely love. We have a giant community of people doing fan art and fan fiction, and somebody wrote some music about some characters, and there's a lot of things called shipping that happens. I'm not going to get into that, but we did an episode of our podcast recently called the shipping episode, and we said, write in all your shipping questions, and we'll answer them all, and also tell you in which realities, which things you want to be true or true. They all are. Yeah, that was a risky one. That was a weird episode. But as a result, our fan community is like, oh my gosh, this is the thing that I did not intend at the beginning. The thing that I wanted at the beginning, the very beginning of this talk and the very beginning of this whole process in 2010 was like, I want a game in which I feel like a hero. And the thing that I accidentally did, and now I can look back and go, wow, that really worked, was instead I made a game in which I felt like a hero, but now I kind of actually feel like an editor-in-chief pounding on my desk and demanding photos of Spider-Man. What I created was a game in which the people that play it and the people that are really into it, they're all the heroes. They identify with certain characters, and many of them identify with many characters. That's great, but they're like, these are my characters, and I decide how these characters do things, and I am these heroes, and these heroes are me in some ways. And that's super cool. That's like the best thing I've ever done. Like, it's strange to me how well that turned out, and I don't think that if I set out to do it back then, if that was my end goal, I don't know that it would have worked as well. The thing that worked well for me was the fact that I wanted a thing that turns out a lot of people did and didn't know how to articulate. So I guess the point of all this, the point of like how to design a thing, be it a game or a piece of media of any sort, and you're going to be working in multiple mediums, is to make sure that you know what it is you're trying to do, which I didn't know. And what I was trying to do was create an experience that was relatable in lots of different ways to lots of different people and give people lots of options. I mentioned a couple of different like archetypes of heroes that I've made, but truthfully there's dozens and dozens of characters in the game, and they all have their own unique stories. They're all very different people, and they all have their own unique mechanics. Every single hero in the card game works completely differently, and that follows through the different places they show up. And as a result, there's almost always something for somebody. And that sort of accidental inclusive design meant that whoever approached the game found something of themselves in it, got something of themselves out of it, and that made it theirs. And so every so often there'll be somebody at a convention who says to me, oh, you said this one thing about this one character in the podcast, and I think you're wrong. I think this is how it actually works. And I'm like, you're absolutely right. That character's yours more than mine now in that way, and I love that. That's amazing to me, and better than I could have hoped for. Anyway, that's about all I had planned on saying. How long did I go? Only half an hour, not even really. So I guess I've got 20 minutes of question time. If you have questions, I'm happy to talk about anything you guys want to talk about. We have a question. Thank goodness. Thank you.
Do you think, like, how you approach your IP, like, is it kind of that carte blanche, like, you know, the reality is what you make of it? Do you think that would be beneficial for, like, IPs in general, like, in more, like comic books, like, other video games, or do you think, like, some of it is, like, okay, they just want to tell a specific story, like, do you think, like, so what do you think of, like, that?
Absolutely. So I think that one of the worst things that ever happened to media is the mouse. And I don't mean that I dislike Disney. I freaking love Disney. But I hate that Mickey Mouse is not being allowed to go into the general suite of things that are public domain. There's a bunch of copyright law that every year gets bumped up, because it used to be, oh, you know, something goes a certain number of years of being owned by a company, and then at that point it goes into public domain because it's been that long. And that gets pushed back every 5 years or so, gets pushed back another 5 years, because Disney is fighting, and they've got the resources to do it infinitely, to make sure that Mickey Mouse never enters public domain. They own that road. And that's fine, they can do that, but I think as a result it makes people very afraid to let other people play with their characters. I also think it's super good to tell people, to tell a story you intend to tell. The trick is, and like with all the stuff that I've made a lot of like, here's the story that I'm telling, and we get to like the 11th hour of the story, and then I hand it over to players. So I say, okay, here's everything that led up to this monumental conflict. Now you're into the final conflict. Do it. Let me know what happens with it. or don't, like it's yours. And that's the thing that attracted people to it in the first place. But now when I'm doing the RPG, I'm writing a bunch of stories that are like, this is the story that happens, and here's the story that I'm telling. And sometimes like, this is a story because it'll be a fun, cool superhero story, and sometimes it's a story because it's like, I'm like saying something about society with this, and we'll see if people pick up on it. Regardless, I think that it's good to put out your story, tell the story in a way that you want to, and like create a thing that you're interested in. But then once you've done so, put it out there. Let people engage with it in a way that works for them. Like, let people dig into it in a way that they find something of themselves in it and take it in a direction that you didn't expect. Now, that is not to say you should not protect your IP. Like I said, I have complete creative control over my babies when other people are working on them in a professional sense. And that's great for me, but, and so like you need to be careful. Like there was a game that almost came out this fall. The game is still coming out, but there's a game that came out this fall that was a game about comic book conflicts, and they weren't superheroes, they were just comic book heroes, was the argument that was told to me. And it's a semi-cooperative game where a group of people play as these individual characters against an opposition in an ever-changing environment, and it takes about an hour to play. My elevator pitch for Sentinels of the Multiverse, which is my card game that I made back in the day, is Sentinels of the Multiverse. It's a 3 to 5 player game where you play as a hero fighting against a terrible villain in an ever-changing environment, and it takes about half an hour to an hour to play. So this game like looks a lot like my game, and that's fine. There's space there. I want there to be more and more games like that out there. This game was called The Sentinels. And so I sent them a bunch of emails, and I had my lawyer send them a bunch of emails, and now that game is called something else. Not because I'm like, no, that word's my word. It definitely isn't. I didn't invent that word. But I've got to protect my trademarks, or I will lose them, the way trademark law works. So it's also, in the similar sort of sense, it's important to protect the things you've created to make sure that, hey, with these things that I've created, these are the ways that I am engaging with, and these are the things that I'm doing with them. But then also letting people break those rules, as long as they're not doing it. If somebody said, okay, I'm going to take Christopher's characters, and I'm going to put them into a game, and then I'm going to sell that game for money, that's when I say, hi, great, let's talk. But if people are just enjoying these things, they're making fan art, they're enjoying these things on their own sort of sense, that's ideal. Like, if you think about any of the big properties, Star Wars, or Lord of the Rings, or any of the Marvel movies, or DC stuff, everybody's got their own stories and their own, like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if these things happened? And that's great. That's how a property does well. And a lot of smaller or lesser-known creators like myself feel like they need to be as protective of their IPs as bigger companies are. And you do need to in like a copyright trademark sense, but not in a storytelling sense. Like let people tell stories. People telling their own stories with your characters is how the big things got even bigger. That's like everybody has, not everybody, most people have opinions on how they feel Star Wars should or should not be presented, whether that has happened in a movie or not. And that's why Star Wars is really successful, is because people have their own connections to it. Yes? Yeah.
Were there ever any points in the process where you looked at a character or looked at a mechanic and said, maybe I should change this?
Yeah. Definitely. Yeah. So there's definitely, so the question is there ever a time in the process of turning one game from one medium into moving it to another in which I realized, oh man, that didn't work, maybe I should change this. And I'm not certain, but I'm going to answer both questions. I'm not certain if you're asking if I should change it in this end or if I change it in the original thing. In the video game version of the card game, there's several cards, a double-digit number, but not a triple-digit number, which is it's like, okay, good. Because there's definitely thousands of different cards in the game. But there's a low double-digit number of cards that, in importing them in the video game, I went, oh my goodness gracious, like this, now that I'm like making video game rules about how this works at the digital table and all this stuff here, not only does the text of this card need to change for the video game version, but in future print runs of the tabletop game, of the card game, I am changing the text on that card because seeing how it played out here, it needs to change there. Now that's in the same game, on two different mediums, the same game on table or on the video game platform. But in that case, there's definitely stuff that happened that made me change a thing on both sides. To zoom out a little bit, is there anything that, say, in the moving from a card game to the board game or a card game to an RPG, that something needed to change? And there definitely were. And those, fortunately, they weren't things that retroactively changed something about the card game where I was like, oh, because this character has to go in this direction for them to work on the tabletop thing, I need to change something about the card game. Those were all like, okay, in the card game they're one way. The first board, Sentinel Tactics, which is the first board game that I made for the world of Sentinel Comics. And that game takes place in an alternate reality, in the future alternate reality from the card game. So I'm like, hey, I can do whatever I want with these characters and we're good. The RPG takes place in the same reality as the card games, but after the events of the last expansion. I mentioned there was the final expansion that raised $1.5 million on Kickstarter. That is an expansion called Oblivion, and it's this world multiverse ending event where this giant cosmic entity comes and blows things up, and it's great. But the RPG takes place in that world after that event happens. But even still with those things, it's like, okay, here's the deal. I've got this character. Her name is Unity. She makes robots with her mind. She's a pile of metal. She goes, boop, now it's a robot. Go fight for me. And in the card game, I represented that in a certain way where she has cards on her deck that are robots, but she can't just put them into play. She has to do an activity to get them into play. That's how that works. For the RPG, that was actually easier. Because in the card game, I had to be like, okay, this card, all the robot cards have a line of text that says, this card can't interplay during your play phase. Ever play this card. However, there's other cards that say at the start of turn, you can destroy a card and put a card into play. Okay, great, so I can do that. There's tricky things I can do. In the RPG, I can say, look, this is the way you make robots. When you make robots, you roll your die pool here, and you use one of these dice to make your robot, and then that die isn't a die anymore, it's now a robot, and it goes around and does things on its own. And with that in mind, wow, now, given the mechanics of this game, I can still make it so that Unity has to be doing something to make her robots, but it's a more seamless process. The card game was a little bit like you have to get around the process. The RPG is kind of encouraging you to do this process. So I created some story fiction about Unity over these years. When you first see her, she's like this young hero, and she's an intern to this other superhero team, and she's like figuring stuff out. Now she's like fully in command of her powers. She's been doing this a long time. She knows what she's about, and she's much more casual in her creation of robots. And so anything there was like, okay, I'm going to advance these stories, I'm going to change these stories to fit the mechanics, and because they weren't taking place at the exact same time, that was fine. Now, the character Unity, who makes robots, is in the RPG at the same time as she's in the video game that is the new one that's a tactics video game that's not related to any of it's not using the same mechanics as any of the tabletop games. And those two games take place at the exact same time. Fortunately, that game is a video game that's not a port of any sort of tabletop game, and so I can just do everything on the back end. So you're doing a very similar thing where she is in command of her powers. She just very casually makes robots to go fight for her, and the player's like, great, I'm going to make a robot so I can do this thing, and I turn this scrap here into a robot. And then on the back end, the video game says, okay, great, we remove that environmental aspect there, so there's no longer a car or a fire hydrant there, and now there's this robot, and the properties that were used in the toughness of this fire hydrant or car are now put onto this robot, and so I can do all that stuff in a way that players don't see. But the character had to bend both ways to make that work. Does that make sense? Does that answer the question? Okay, cool. More questions? Yes? Person who I've never met.
Yeah. Where do you see Sentinels going as an IP in the future?
The question is, where do I see Sentinels going as an IP in the future? And that's a really weird question, because in 2010, it was going nowhere. I made 2 copies, one for me, one for the artist. They were really crappy, and that was it. That was everything. That was everything I wanted. It wasn't just like this was like I didn't have any aspirations for more, because that was it. I succeeded. So I won that game in 2010. I got everything I wanted out of that in 2010. Now, I'm like, okay, great. I'm going to make this RPG, and I've got a ton of RPG stuff I'm doing. I've got another board game that's super secret that I'm going to make in 2 or 3 years for it. I'm not doing anything else with the card game. The card game is done, but I've got other things that I want to do with the IP. And the podcast is going to keep going. I'm doing some live streams on Twitch of me running the RPG through stories that are quote-unquote canonical. And we've had, I can actually talk about this because it fell through. We had somebody series, and we drew up a brief with them and talked about like how it would go and what it would cover and how the writing and the art and all that would happen. And he shopped it around to a bunch of different networks, and nobody bit. But this was in 2014, and in 2014 we were less than a third of the size we are now. Do I think we're going to have an animated series someday? No, I don't think so. But would I be open to it happening? Gosh, yes, I'd love that. So like really, I have no idea. But also, if you think about the comic book characters that everybody knows there now, that everybody is, you know, absorbing the media from now in one way or another, those characters, a lot of them came out of the comics that started in the late 30s and early 40s. And the people that made those then, like, who knew? This is, I'm only 8 years in now on making these stories and characters and things. And I feel like I've seen the breadth of what they can do. I'm like, well, that's not going to go any further. But I have that same talk with myself every year where I'm like, well, at this point, I made this game and then I made it into a product. I sold the product. That's great, but we'll probably make a couple expansions. No, we made 8. We made 8 expansions. And people wanted us to keep making more. It's like, no, no, this is the end that I've written from the beginning. I'm not going to keep going. So I don't know. I really don't know. I'm up for it. I'm excited to see where it goes. The biggest hindrance to it continuing, the biggest 2 hindrances are A, popularity. Who wants to read about these comic book characters when you have so many other comics and movies and stuff going on? And that's fine. I don't mind. But like, I get it when people are like, well, I could read these stories, or I could read about the X-Men. It's like, yeah, the X-Men are really cool. The other hindrance is that I'm a big baby who wants creative control over my stuff all the time. And so like, it's going to be difficult for me to let go of parts of that, to let other people, and that's what will need to happen to let it grow. If we were going to do an animated series, I wouldn't be the writer of that series. I want to be, and I do a good job too, I think. But I don't have any sort of credit in the people that make those things. And for a show like that to get off the ground, you would have to have a writer who somebody's like, oh, this is the person that wrote a couple of episodes of Avatar: The Last Airbender. Sure, we'll do this show. Great. As opposed to, here's the guy that like made the card game this is based on. No one cares about that guy. So I have to be willing to let go, and I have been. Like it's a process. So I'm very aware of it. Question back here.
So you had mentioned that the multiverse was like a happy accident.
Yeah.
What is a unhappy accident?
Oh man.
Where you put the characters in a place where you're uncomfortable.
Sure. Fortunately, I get to really casually and easy erase those things when it happens, because it happens all the time. That I wrote on a card that I put out in 2013 that this one character said this one thing in issue 163 of this book. And I did not map out the spreadsheet of exactly when every issue landed in what year and what month, which I have done so. I did not do that until a couple of years ago. And so there's anything that's pre that, there's a 30% chance that one of those attributions is wrong. And this doesn't matter to 99% of people that engage with any of the media. However, as I mentioned, at this point, I've sold hundreds of thousands of copies of the core game Sentinels of the Multiverse. So 99% is actually, 1% is actually a pretty big number. And those people are really good at emailing me about it. But like I said, I can quickly and easily solve those things because I can retcon them, which is just a tried and true thing in comic history. It's like, oh yeah, we said this one thing happened, but actually it's something completely different, and we're going to move forward as if it's always been that way. And the other thing I can say is, guys, I was super fallible and I made those mistakes. Being willing to own up to my mistakes and being willing to say, that was a thing that I said and I was definitely wrong and it's actually this instead, has been the most useful tool in moving forward with this property and doing more and bigger things with it. And saying, oh yeah, we had this one story and we said this character came about in the 80s, but there's no way this character came about in the 80s. There's actually a really good example of that is the hero Bunker, who is a hero that wears a big metal suit. It's like a big bodysuit sort of thing that shoots guns, and it's like 12 feet tall, and that's great. And power armor didn't exist before Heinlein. Heinlein is the first time that in pop culture that we get power armor, but I said this character came out in the 50s. That's impossible. So I just had to later retcon and be like, oh yeah, this character existed in the 50s, but at that point he was just a tank driver. He drove a tank. And it wasn't until the 70s that he got the suit of power armor, and now we're good. And so yeah, being willing to say I was wrong and what I said in the past was wrong has solved most of those problems. But I've definitely had things from small problems where people said, well, this says issue 163, but according to what you said in this podcast and then this other podcast, that had to be issue 162. I was like, you got me, and you're definitely correct. And but then there's other problems too, where people say, like, continuity-wise, this character's over here, and then they say that they're over here. They can't be in both books at the same time. And my answer to that is, Batman and Wolverine are in like 17 different books at the same time at a different point in comic book history. So I'm good. I've got precedent there. Yes?
What's your favorite character to play?
Yeah, I love this question because I hate this question. So I like getting it so I cannot answer it. So all of these characters are my babies. I love all my babies equally. But actually, a more useful answer is that all the characters are written to be for someone else. And the biggest strength that I have as a designer is that A, I view games as stories, and I like building stories and telling stories. stories, and so like that has really helped me out. But the other thing is that I'm pretty good at putting myself in different people's shoes. I'm pretty good at saying, I want to play a character that works like this today. So I want to play a character that works like this today, and I can design for those different types of players. And so as a result, like depending on what kind of mood I'm in, I usually like to play a character that somebody at the table that I'm playing with doesn't get how they work or they haven't seen them work before. If I'm sitting down to play with a group of people that I've never played with before, I'm like, hey, what is a character that you guys just can't make work? What's a character that you just don't like the way they work? There's lots of characters like, oh, this character is underpowered, or this character is broken, or this character doesn't work. And I disagree with those statements. So I'm like, tell me which character you think is broken. I will happily play them and show you how I play them, which is one of many ways to play them and not necessarily the correct way. So yeah, among heroes, I don't have a favorite. Villains, now we're talking. People are like, oh man, you have a fun job. You get to write all these heroes. I also get to write all the villains. That's the stuff I really love. I get to write doomsday plots and all sorts of like, we're going to blow up the world or the entire multiverse and all the ways those work. Those are the ones that I like. And I have favorite villains. I love Citizen Dawn. She is a terrible person who is a superpower supremacist. If you don't have superpowers, you're not a person in her eyes. She's horrible, just horrible. I don't like her because I think we should hang out. I like her because I really like the way she works. I have a lot of different characters that like I am attached to in those different ways. But yeah, it's a good question that I've never successfully answered. Yeah. That's a great question. That happens all the time. I would say the vast majority of mechanics that I make are not fun. Where I like create a mechanic and we get it to the table and we play it and we're like, oh, I'm doing busy work, I'm not playing a game. And so there's a significant number, probably like 3/5 of all of the different mechanics that I make in any game get left on the cutting room floor. And the thing that I do that does work is that so for the core game of Sentinels of Multiverse, it's 10 different heroes, 4 different villains, 4 different environments. And I made way more than that when we were first putting together the core game. And I boiled it down to 10, 4 that were the most fun. And I left a lot of stuff on the floor. And a lot of then later I brought that back. I'm like, okay, character, let's put you again. And let's keep working with you. But similar to being willing to say I was wrong about stuff, I'm willing to say, I was wrong about this. And just like, nah, this isn't fun. It's not enjoyable. Let's get it out of here. Let's throw it away. I'm a very harsh editor. And so being willing to give up, at least temporarily, on a thing is big. And then if you're like, okay, well, here's the deal. I really want this mechanic to work. I really want it to go. Then just keep reiterating it. And a lot of the times what I'll do is I'll return to the story. I'll be like, okay, I keep trying to make the mechanics of this thing work where, like, whenever you play a card, a thing happens, and then I want to make this recursive loop. That's the thing I want to make for this character. Who is this character? Who are they in their daily life? What sort of stories are they told? What genre of comics are they published in? Are they like Golden Age or Silver Age comics? Are they more horror comics? Like what's the deal with this character? And then once I know that, then I'm like, okay, that's what I should be doing at the table. And that'll either help me fix the mechanic or make it be willing to throw it. All right, I've been given the 5-minute mark and I've been given it a couple of minutes ago. So do we have any more questions? I have one more over here, and I'll do one after that. More villains. Oh, villains are way more fun than heroes. Now, I like making heroes, and I like making the mechanics for them and all that, but making villains is so much more fun than making heroes. Just, oh my gosh, yes. Easier? No, it's harder. It's harder to make villains, because villains are the scenario. Heroes don't exist without supervillains. Superheroes, like running around with superpowers fighting like regular criminals is boring and kind of awkward. It's like, I have super strength. Stop, person holding up a convenience store. Wow, that was really unnecessary. Like, superhero stories are like they require awesome supervillains, and so a lot of the storytelling of what happens at the table comes from the villain deck. So yeah, so that's a lot more work, but it's the work that I enjoy the most. All right, last question from Marshall. I'm sorry. All right.
How do you judge when you've like made enough lore for something? Like, how do you determine?
I'm really bad about this. So the question is, how do I judge when I've made enough lore? And I am awful in that making lore is what I do for fun, and so I'll make like hundreds and hundreds of pages for like a small thing that I'm doing, and then it'll be like, oh right, it's time to actually make the thing. I recently played on a live stream of a D&D game that some friends of mine were doing that had this regular going game, and it got like 4 years, and they had me in for 2 episodes as a side character, and I submitted to them 20 pages of backstory for this character, and like what all this stuff is doing. And they're like, no one cares. You're going to show up, say some things, and disappear. And I was like, yeah, but all this backstory. So how much is enough lore? Enough that if you give it to somebody else, and they're looking at the deck or the game of something you're making, and they're reading the lore, they feel like this, there's more of this than there is of this, but all of this is informed by that. So that's kind of, I try to do more of this than this, but not so much that you've like killed yourself in the process of making it. All right, 1 minute remaining. Marshall, go quick.
5 years from now, you want to make Sentinels again.
Yeah.
Reboot it, or you do Sentinels Next Generation?
I do Sentinels Next Generation. I thought about this. I'm like, someday I might want to do the card game again, because I've said the card game's over. But surely, like, if I in 2028, if I in 2035 say Sentinel's coming back, nobody's going to say, who's that? Like, people are going to be excited, or have, what's that? Nobody's ever heard of that. And if I did that, I wouldn't just reboot it. I would start over and be like, these are all the great-grandchildren of those heroes, or Sentinels 2099, or something like that. So, all right. Thank you guys so much for listening to me blather on.
It ain't no game, but they saying welcome to the second level.